There's a naivety to childhood and beauty that surrounds summer camp. All these years later, I cannot walk outside after a rainstorm without smelling camp. I cannot walk down a gravel path without hearing camp, and for a very long time, I could not sleep completely through the night without remembering camp. When you ask a child to describe their camping days, they'll usually answer positively. A retreat from a modern world that allowed them a rare chance to bask in overwhelming simplicity. Friendships that held true years after they said their Saturday goodbyes. The way that a lake was the closest thing to a bath that some took all week. And the fireflies dancing through the tree lines. When you ask a counselor to describe their camping days, they will lie. Maybe not intentionally, but they'll hide away their strangest encounters experienced while living far from civilization. Whether for the love of camp or for the desire not to remember. Some stories aren't uttered to another living soul. I believe in the opposite. I learned that I couldn't move forward without finally acknowledging him. In my experience, the scariest thing about camp isn't living alone in the woods, absent from modernity. The scariest thing about camp aren't the stories that are told late at night, surrounded by the fires and accented by the howls of the woodland winds. No. The scariest thing about camp are the children. I remember the excitement of Sunday afternoons. You arrived after a short respite from the week before and groggily accepted your assignments, always hoping for the oldest boys, always dreading the youngest. It's not that I didn't connect with the little ones, but running a camp of 6-year-olds was torturous. This could be offset with the assistance of a co-counselor, someone with whom to share duties and responsibilities. The problem with excelling at your job, however, is that you become entrusted with accomplishing all of this by yourself. Needless to say, I wasn't surprised when I was assigned to Camp 1. Camp 1 actually slept 24, so I couldn't complain about 16. Disappointed as I was, I plastered a smile on my face and greeted the campers and parents warmly. For most, it was their first time away from home and away from their children. I had to assure both parties that camp would be an amazing experience. This is probably why I read his parents as being apprehensive about leaving him behind. Looking back on it, though, their apprehension existed from the fear that he might follow them home. His name was Luke, an Americanized version of Luca that had been corrected with his adoption. His curly dark hair emphasized his steely eyes, alluding to his Eastern European heritage, while creating a stark difference to his blonde-haired parents. Luke didn't speak when I introduced myself, but stared through me towards the children playing and unpacking in the cabin. After collecting the necessary paperwork, I tried to initiate a conversation detailing our activities and the mission of camp. Mid-sentence, his parents walked away. No goodbyes and no parting hugs. Zero affection was transferred between these adults and their child. Oddly, none of this seemed to bother Luke. He regarded his adopted parents as less significant than broken playthings. Pushing past me, he entered cabin 1 and stood watching the other boys. Their merriment died as they tried to introduce themselves and were rejected by his gaze and off-putting demeanor. No one dared approach him further. I witnessed 15 kids remain stationary as one claimed a bed. It was during the height of July, but I'll never forget how chilled I felt at that moment. Sunday was always a short, uneventful day. The kids attended swimming lessons for the first time to check their skills and see which levels of the lake were appropriate for them, had dinner, and then participated in evening activities, all the while being pestered with rules and regulations. Following this, they returned to their cabins for lights out. Since counselors were required in the dining hall on Sunday evenings for announcements and further scheduling, the care of cabin 1 was left to my good friend JP. I finished the meeting around midnight and headed towards the boys' settlement to relieve JP of his duties. Upon entering the courtyard, I saw him sitting on my porch's railing, his vision unbroken through the window. Exhaustedly, he turned when I advanced and asked, "Hey, who's a foreign kid?" No one was ever surprised by problems from the youngest boy's cabin, especially on the first night. We weren't allowed to say homesick. The connotation of sick lent credence to the fact that something was wrong. Instead, we had to say missing home. It was a positive sign if you could get through Sundays without 60% of your cabin crying for their moms. Yet, Luke didn't strike me as a child who would miss his mother. What happened? I inquired. He hasn't even unrolled his sleeping bag. JP paused. When I tried to encourage him, he growled at me. And I couldn't help but laugh. He growled at you? Yeah. He's still sitting on his bunk with his pack next to him. Doing what? Watching. I wanted nothing more than to crawl into bed, but I wasn't going to let a 6-year-old run my cabin. After dismissing JP, I went to Luke and offered politely to help him unroll his sleeping bag. My kindness was met with more growls. Are you growling at me? You're 6 years old. Do you think that I'm scared of you? And for the first time in the day, he spoke. In a deep, guttural voice, he claimed, I'm the devil. And I easily brushed this off. Well, even Satan sleeps, Luke. And luckily for him, though, he doesn't have to get up at 7:30 for flagpole. And with that, I unrolled his bed, did a quick head count of my campers, and retired to the counselor's quarters. My room was small and separated by the kids by a sheet stapled to the doorway. For some unexplainable reason, and this still happens today, when a camper needed you, instead of calling your name, they knocked 3 times on the wall next to the sheet. As annoying as that sound is, I made it a point to have the kids wake me up for whatever reason, without worrying that I would be mad. I'd much rather lose sleep and know where my campers are than the opposite. So when I heard the knocking on the first night, I answered back in the politest tone that I could muster. Hey, what's wrong? A quiet voice shifted through the sheet. It's Luke. He's being too loud. I glanced at my alarm clock and I saw that it was 4:31. Great, I thought. There's 3 more hours. I rose from my comfortable bed and entered the main part of the cabin. I found Luke thrashing back and forth on top of his sleeping bag, speaking a language that I didn't recognize. I tried gently tapping him on the shoulder, but to no avail. As his cries became deeper and throatier, I resorted to shaking him. Luke! Luke! Wake up! His eyes flickered open at the sound of my voice, and at first he looked confused. Hey, buddy. It's okay, I told him. You were just having a bad dream. And he angrily furrowed his brow in response to my statement and rolled over to face the wall. I ushered the other kids back to their beds and then returned to him. Do you want me to sit with you until you fall back asleep? I whispered, and his growls answered in a negative. I waited a few more minutes in case he changed his mind. And when it wasn't apparent that he wouldn't, I returned to my bed, pulled the covers up over my chin, and then I listened. Amidst the ensuing silence, I should have been able to sleep. And as hard as I tried, I couldn't. Monday. A few hours after flagpole, I left my campers at the beach for swimming lessons, which happened every day, and headed towards the staff hangout. This blessing time of the morning was my period off, so I happily relaxed and chain smoked. During my final years on staff, I learned that this was the only vice that calmed my nerves when working with children. Actually, most staff became aware of this at some point or another. And I stayed only until 10:20 when I had to return to the kids and was shocked to be greeted by 16 smiling faces. It honestly was night and day with Luke. Somehow, in the course of 50 minutes, he had managed to shed his repellent demeanor and become friends with the rest of the cabin. He still didn't talk a lot, possibly due to embarrassment over the foreign drawl in his words. But when he smiled, the others weren't dissuaded from associating with him. Crafts followed lessons, and while most of the kids were busy making lanyards or building things out of popsicle sticks, Luke sat diligently coloring, and when he finished, he proudly held up the drawing for me to see. Artistically, he had used the broken pencils and mostly spent crayons of the craft shop to depict a Victorian-style home with 4 people standing in front, 2 parents and 2 boys. Who are they? I asked, intrigued. And in a very thick voice, he responded, My family. He drew the parents with hair as dark as his. And I wouldn't think about this picture again until Saturday. The boys were extra rowdy Monday night, but I was so grateful that they were getting along that I didn't mind. Sure, a cohesive cabin made my life easier, but it also increased the positive reactions that kids had at camp. We could accomplish more activities, and there would be a higher prosperity for them to return. I'm convinced that I'd sleep soundly through the night. The screams started at 4:31. Instantly, I lunged from my bunk. In the process, I must have become entangled in the blankets and fallen to the floor. This part I don't remember, and it was only assumed later after I discovered rug burns on my knees from the carpeting. I saw lights popping on in the cabin around me and quickly found the switch on my own. Luke was violently rolling from side to side, banging his body against the wall and repeating the same words over and over. His pronunciation losing meaning as the speed of his phrasing and screams intensified. And while it was difficult to clearly ascertain what he was saying, I did hear the name. Aylin. It sounds crazy, but even though the deafening sounds coming from the small child's throat, the repetition of Aylin almost sounded apologetic. And with one final ear-splitting scream, Luke sat up, drenched in sweat. And for a moment, there were tears streaming down his cheeks as he shook, taking in his surroundings. The lapse was fleeting. Upon realizing that he was the center of attention, his gaze hardened, and with a hostile glance at the campers gathered around him, he rested his head back on his pillow, as if nothing happened, and returned to facing the wall. Tuesday. The next morning, I went to the main office to sort through Luke's medical paperwork. It was our job every Sunday to take note of any special conditions that the campers may have, but it was also possible to overlook a few things. I read every page of Luke's file, only to find that there wasn't anything clinically wrong with him. This didn't surprise me. Many times parents omitted items out of their refusal to accept that there could be something wrong with their child. My thoughts on this matter, however, were interrupted by my friend Michael entering the room. "You don't look very well," he said, helping to pick up the medical files that I scattered across the floor. "I haven't been sleeping." "So does that mean that you're staying in tonight?" he asked. Twice a week, staff were permitted to leave camp without having to return until flagpole. If I chose to leave, Michael would be assigned to spending the night in cabin 1, and I answered honestly, "I'm not sure." "Maybe you shouldn't," he said. "At least you could get a full night's sleep away from here. You're no good to any of us if you get sick." "That's true." "In the meantime, is there anything else that I need to be aware of?" he asked, pointing to the medical files. "On the record, clean bills of health all around." "And off the record?" "Be mindful, Luke." It was also required that once a week, counselors take their campers for an overnight somewhere on the grounds. And at lunch was when I read the disastrous forecast for the next few days. Rain every evening. This promptly canceled all plans I had on sleeping outside with the kids. "It's another setback," I said to my best friend Jake, handing him the newspaper. He set it aside and added yet another large glob of sour cream onto his tacos. "Yeah, I heard the screams last night. I assume things aren't going well." I feel bad for the kids. They were looking forward to sleeping under the stars, making s'mores and telling stories. I'm just worried that the negativity of the past 2 nights might, eat away at their perception of how great camp is. "You're not leaving until 10, right?" "Yeah." Michael convinced me to go out. "Then, when evening activities are all over around 9:15, bring your kids back to my cabin and we'll have a fire," Jake proposed. "Rain's not supposed to start until 11. It'll give us about 45 minutes to attempt an extremely deconstructed version of an overnighter. And you can still leave for camp on time." As much as I hated to admit when he was right, as much as I always hate to admit when he's right, Jake had a good point. Being counselor of the oldest boys, he was privileged to have a secluded area in the woods with a fire pit right outside the front door. It was close enough to our settlement for the boys to feel secure, but far enough away to add an air of excitement. Before lunch ended, we decided on a big brother, little brother style event to create something positive from the few hours of respite that the rain would give us. This was the beginning of an almost deadly mistake. We were preparing to leave later that evening when Jake texted on his need for a lighter. He had plenty of fluid and wood to build the fire, but lacked a way to start it. Mine was almost out of fuel, so I rummaged through the stack of drawers nearest my bed and found a large box of matches. I packed these into my knapsack, grabbed a crate full of s'mores guts, and led the kids down the path to Jake's cabin. The trail curved through some of the camp's remaining pine trees, Had it not been for the white Christmas lights Jake hung as guidance, we could easily have tripped on a very large, exposed route. The home of the oldest boys was small and rectangular, housing only 10, including a counselor in one room. To the left was a creek that drained from the swimming lake, and into the right was a large cluster of black cherry, maple, and tulip trees that separated the oldest boys from the rest of the settlement. Finding Jake, I handed over the matches and watched as a fire roared to life, the smell of camp happily infiltrating our nostrils. For 45 minutes, Jake's boys helped mine with their gooey treats and told PG versions of classic ghost stories. Had we stayed longer, a guitar would have emerged and ridiculous songs would have been sung, but the clock ticked ever towards 10. And finally, we collected our wrappers, put the lighter fluid back in the milk crate kept alongside the cabin, thanked everyone for their hospitality, and corralled the matches back into the box. Packing these once more, I said my goodbyes and led the little boys back to cabin 1. Michael was unenthusiastically waiting for our arrival. I quickly changed my clothes, put a few toiletries in my knapsack, wished him well, and left camp for the evening. And as I walked down the hill towards the parking lot, I had the strangest sensation of being watched. And when I turned around, Luke's face hurriedly disappeared from the window and out of sight. Wednesday. Michael was wide awake when I entered the cabin at 7:20 the following morning. "How'd everything go?" I asked, opening a can of Mountain Dew. I wasn't a coffee drinker, and the tea at camp is sadly decaffeinated. "Well, things were all right until about 4:30. "What happened? The storm keep the kids up?" "No, we all slept soundly. Yet somehow I still heard the floor creaking over all the rain." "The floor creaking?" "Yeah. When I opened my eyes, I saw that kid that you warned me about, Luke. He was standing next to your bed, just staring at me. I must have surprised him because I moved to get up and he jumped back. And I was stunned. Why on earth was he there? I asked him, but he refused to answer me. Did he growl?" "Growl? I wish. What did he do then?" "He just creepily laughed." "He laughed? Well," I concluded, "I guess it's an improvement from the screaming." Over breakfast, I pulled Luke aside. He appeared like he did on Monday, friendly and normal, albeit still lacking with his words. He was confused when I questioned him about the counselor's quarters, almost eliciting sincerity from his manneristic responses. And so, following this, on my period off, I once again checked his medical paperwork. I was still hoping to find an answer to this strange behavior and alleviate my concerned mind. There wasn't anything documented in relation to sleepwalking or night terrors this time. However, I did notice something that I'd missed before. Luke's address was listed as a P.O. box. One of the biggest activities that we had on Wednesday was a double period of horseback riding. The stable staff had ingeniously taken into account that some of the kids might be scared of these large creatures, and thus, before we arrived, they had set aside apples and oat-flavored treats. By feeding one of the horses, it was hoped that the campers would see their tame, kind nature, which in turn would minimize their fear of riding. Luke was the only one who refused. I didn't want to make him uncomfortable or force him onto the horse. But after 5 minutes of convincing, I managed to talk him into feeding one. Luke was still a little nervous, so he stood beside me as I gently coaxed a horse over to the fence. When the elderly mare came near, I stepped aside so that way Luke could show her the treat that he held in his hand. And when the mare caught sight of him, she thunderously reared into her hind legs and whinnied so as to alert the other horses. A few in the yard began to buck, causing the campers to race back to where they all stood. All of this came as a shock to Luke, who, though removed from the mare by a fence, fell backwards into the mud. "Stupid horse!" he screamed, finding the largest rock within his reach to launch into her direction. He didn't even come close. The mare had galloped away so rapidly that she broke through the fence on the other side of the enclosure. And Luke rose slowly, dusting his pants, mumbling to himself, and he spat in my direction and then walked to join the others at the safety of their picnic tables. Like JP on Sunday night, everyone was assigned an evening in charge of their respective settlement. Wednesday was mine. It was my duty to make sure that the boys from the other cabins were asleep at a reasonable hour and kept safe until their counselors returned, or until another staff member was tasked with staying the night in their cabin. Nothing out of the ordinary transpired. A few stories, kids refusing to sleep. All in all, my night was unremarkable. Still, I was appreciative when the settlement finally went quiet. I removed the picture of Dorian Gray from my knapsack and relaxed with some light reading. A few chapters later, there was a staff member in every cabin, and so I returned to mine. Tiredly, I opened the separate entrance to the counselor's quarters and stared at the mess before me. All of my possessions had been searched through. It had taken me an hour to clean everything, and thankfully, upon checking multiple times, nothing seemed to be missing. My gut reaction was never to blame the campers. Staff pulled pranks constantly. I was actually impressed that someone was able to sneak in and create this kind of chaos without me noticing. And by the time that I had finished restoring order and my head hit the pillow that night, the sound of rain beating on the uninsulated roof immediately put me to sleep. Thursday. I woke for flagpole to find the front door with muddy footprints leading to Luke's bed. It was common for kids to walk to the bathroom in the middle of the night, but uncommon to do so without alerting a counselor. Perhaps he didn't want to wake me. I wanted so much to believe this simple truth, if I only knew what I knew now. Thursday was my second evening off. Instead of leaving camp, I decided to stay and spend some time with friends. Leaving camp was always fun, but having camp to yourself was a blast. I never told my campers that I would be returning. When I entered through my door to go to bed then, I was extra quiet. I didn't want to alert them to my presence or scare them into thinking that someone was breaking in. It might sound ridiculous, but you'd be surprised. The rain had started in earnest when I drifted off into sleep. The loud pang of thunder woke me up. Through the flashes of lightning, I saw the small frame of a child standing by the wall. I reached for the light switch, knocking over my alarm clock that was again reading 4:31. I saw the figure start to approach, and as soon as the light snapped on, Luke stopped in his tracks. The continued bursts of lightning oddly emphasized the animalistic features of his face, as water ran down his heaving chest to pool at his muddy feet. We both stared at each other.
Luke, what the hell are you doing?
His flashlight dropped to the floor, shattering the glass bulb. He was flustered and distracted, searching the room with his eyes, apparently unsure why he was standing near the head of my bed. And when he didn't answer, I stood and cautiously directed him back to his bunk. I don't think that either of us slept the rest of the night. Friday. The last full day of camp was unusually bittersweet. But not this time. Not for me. I was ecstatic knowing that Luke would be going home tomorrow. I just needed to make it through the night. It was our last crafts period when I truly became scared. As before, Luke sat diligently coloring. This time when he finished and proudly held up the drawing, it was of our cabin. And through one of the windows, you could see a crude depiction of me. That is, if you looked closely past the flames that were engulfing the structure. The crafts director happened to see this. Astonished, she asked Luke, "Is this supposed to be Jonathan?" And with a sickening smile, he answered, "Hopefully." I was too ashamed to report what was happening. Realistically, how could I be scared of a 6-year-old? So instead, I hatched a plan. I would stay awake through the night to ensure that Luke didn't harm himself or another camper. And when the evening activity finished, I walked my kids back to our settlement. And through the trees, I could see flames rising from Jake's fire pit. The rain was supposed to hold off until midnight, and Jake was going to give his boys one last fire. As the rambunctiousness of my cabin slowly died, I felt my eyelids growing heavier. And for good measure, I set my alarm clock at 4:15, just in case. And then I waited. I remember wetness dripping onto my forehead and being startled to feel my chest compressed. Jerking awake, I saw him. Luke was perched on top of me, his mouth wide open, drool running from his bottom lip. He screamed as he slashed ferociously at my face. The searing pain of my flesh ripping was trivial in the moment. I had to get away from him more than anything. Without regard for his safety then, I forcefully shoved him onto the floor. Realizing that I much outweighed him, Luke lunged for the door of the counselor's quarters. I tried to chase after him, but tripping over my discarded and broken alarm clock, and in turn I fell down a short flight of stairs, my body rolling into the storm raging overhead. The constant flares of lightning ruined my night vision. Instinctively, I covered one eye to at least give me a fighting chance as I searched through the trees. The harshness of the rain overpowered any sound Luke might have made, the downpour obscuring any trace of his footsteps. And this explains why I didn't know that he was right behind me. I felt the blow to my knee first, knocking me down and rendering me breathless. I then saw one last flash of lightning before millions of stars blurred my line of sight. And next came the darkness. It was JP who had saved me. JP who had taken an interest in Luke's antics from the first night. JP who sat during meals listening to me speak of Luke's behavior. JP, who had the crafts period following mine and heard the director tell the story of Luke's drawing. And JP, who had tirelessly stayed awake. His sudden, unexpected appearance diverted Luke from his mission. Frantically searching for a way out, Luke swung the log that he had used as a weapon in JP's direction. Those subsequent opportune seconds of distraction that elapsed when JP moved to distance himself from the impact allowed Luke to flee to the safety of the woods. Saturday. I spent a few hours at the hospital as the police assisted staff in searching the grounds for Luke. From what I understood, though, I wasn't privy to all the information. The number listed on Luke's medical form had been disconnected. Even his generic last name, Smith, systematically helped prevent locating his parents. And I don't know what became of him. I was told the rest, but ignored this in favor of returning to camp. After my last camper had been claimed that Saturday morning, I diligently set to cleaning the mess that only a week of little kids could create. Luke's belongings had been removed by this point, but as I lifted his mattress to sweep the wooden boards underneath, there, balled up, was the picture that he drew of his family. Upon closer inspection of the happy quartet, I glimpsed something that I hadn't previously. Erased from the background were the imprints of flames hungrily licking the Victorian home and the faces of those in the foreground. I decided to keep the picture. In its current state, the drawing looked almost remorseful. I figured the detective that I'd spoken to would like to see it. As I left to empty my trash can into the larger barrels outside, I noticed an assortment of objects laying near the cabin. Stooping to pick them up, I discovered the container of lighter fluid from Jake's fire, bits of charred paper, and the remains of my knapsack. I likewise found the scattered pile of spent matches that for the past few days had resided inside that bag. Inclement weather is the natural enemy of camp counselors. Had you asked me before these events, I would have never thought to be more grateful for the rain. People ask me many times about what happened. For some questions, I have answers. Jake kept lighter fluid inside, save for the last night. I assumed this is where Luke would go when everyone else slept, returning each night until he found it. And for others, I don't. I'm still unaware of 4:31 a.m.'s significance or where Luke currently is now. People also ask me why this was my last summer on staff. Up until this, I've cleverly given many reasons as to why I left. Pay wasn't high enough, I needed to focus on collegiate studies. But now they'll know. Those who are listening to this will finally be made aware of how much that week changed me. How much the remembrances of that week still keep me awake at night. You'll often hear it said that the scariest thing about a summer camp is living alone in the woods, or the stories that you're told late at night surrounding the fires. No. From first-hand experience, the scariest things about camp are the children.